Welcome to the Emerging Civil War podcast. I'm Chris Mackowski, and joining me today is Chris Hartley, author of a brand spanking new biography on Daniel Harvey Hill. Chris, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, Chris. It's a real pleasure to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, delighted. Now, I have to admit, I've been super excited when I heard about this book. Let me see if I can get it without showing up. Confederate General D.H. Hill, A Military Life. And Hill is someone who has needed a good biography. Why did you decide to spend time with a man who is notoriously cantankerous?
Well, your first part of the statement was exactly why he needs a biography. There's really never been a full-length biography written of Hill. There have been a couple of attempts. There was, the one that's most known is the Hal Bridges book that came out, I guess, 1961, 1962. But even he admits in the preface that it's not a biography. It's just sort of a overview of key points of Hill's life, more military side, more Civil War. And Hill is just so fascinating. It felt to me like he deserved a full treatment to understand his full life and the setting of what he went through. Um, but the cantankerous side was interesting. I also never expected to stay as long in his company as I did.
You mentioned in your acknowledgments that this was a 10-year project and you had never envisioned it would last a
Yeah.
decade. Tell me a little bit about how did that journey unfold and why did it end up taking 10 years?
Well, number of reasons why. Certainly, life gets in the way. The other piece of it is I've had other projects I've been working on along the way. But I guess the main reason is that Hill never knew when to put his pen down. Um, he was a man of a million words, and those words are scattered in repositories and newspapers and so forth across the country. So it took a while to dig all that up. Number one, number two, it took a while to read it all,
Yeah.
um, to really try to understand who he was at the different phases of his life. And next thing I know, I'll look up and it's over 10 years later, and it's like, wow, what happened? I'm still working on this thing. I got to stop sometime.
And I think the variety of his writings is pretty incredible too, because of course, the battle reports and the letters, which are
Yeah.
the sort of go-to sources for most historians. But like he was editor of a literary magazine.
Yeah.
He really, wrote deeply in sort of the post-war era,
Mhm.
kind of explaining, what was going on. So he's got a variety of kinds of writing to look at.
Indeed. He wrote about education. He wrote in depth about religious topics, books about scripture. He wrote newspaper articles from the front lines during the Mexican War. After the Civil War, you mentioned literary magazine. He published Charlotte, North Carolina's very first magazine, that was full of poetry and feature articles and fiction, but also Civil War history, which was very interesting, and American history. Then he went on to publish a more, I guess you'd say, news style magazine that was really intended to battle Reconstruction. So he kept going and going. And there's probably more words out there I haven't discovered even after all this effort. So
Well, and I suppose I should also throw in a little mention of his math textbook too.
for
You
sure,
can't forget that.
you can't avoid that one, right? I knew that would come up. So
So, as you spent so much time with him, um, what was the big discovery you walked away with? And I don't want you to like give away the store with the book. I want people to get the book, but I'm sure you
yeah.
came up to some insights.
Well, with a guy like Hill, some legends or even tropes have come up over the years, and as with many of those, I think we always find that the truth is a little different than what just people casually say or casually believe. Right? The whole idea that Robert E. Lee got rid of him from the Army of Northern Virginia is not true. Um, the whole idea that he lost the Lost Order is not true. The whole idea that he wandered around grumpy all the time because of health issues, I don't think is true either. Those are some common things you hear about Hill, and I try to delve into each one of them. Anyone who chooses to read what I've written may disagree, but that's part of the fun is really to dive into that and try to lay out the evidence.
Well, and since you mentioned his health issues, I'll start there only because the word dyspepsia is so fun to use.
Yeah.
You start your book by kind of getting into Douglas Southall Freeman and his exploration of Hill in
Mhm.
Lee's Lieutenants. And Freeman seems to lay things squarely at the health issues of Hill, and that's why he's so problematic. He's got these health issues, and you come
Yeah,
back to that at the end of the book too, to kind of be like, but
yeah, yeah.
is that like one of the reasons or the main reason why we kind of have that impression of him?
I think it is, and Freeman is not alone in that supposition. There's a number of historians who have made that argument, and it's understandable, right? Because he did have health issues. He had a spinal malady. He had stomach issues throughout his lifetime. He was known to faint while standing in line in formation at West Point from time to time, right? So things like that would happen to him periodically throughout his lifetime. And he ended up being, he dying of essentially stomach cancer in his old age. And so it would give you a grumpy disposition, right? But but there are other reasons behind that, I think.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and of course, Freeman being, kind of the grand architect of modern thought about the Confederacy, if he says something, it carried a lot of weight in the scholarship that followed him. So I could see where that would kind of carry over.
Well, and what's so fascinating about that opening that you mentioned is that the occasion of that letter was Freeman was writing to Hill's children. He was trying to explain Hill in his Lee's Lieutenant books around the World War II time period, and he was writing to explain why he took the position he did to Freeman's children. And of course, he laid it out and said, "I have to lay him out as I see him. I hope that's okay." Kind of a message.
But you also mentioned like the Freeman even admitted like Hill was problematic to him. It took him a
Yeah,
while to figure him out. Yeah.
problematic, but the kind of guy that a writer loves,
Yeah.
which is probably what has made Hill as fun as he has been to work on. Is there's an adventure on every page kind of thing with Hill. So
Yeah. Now, I have to admit, as a Stonewall Jackson fanboy, one of the first things I did when I got my copy is I, looked at the index and where are the Jackson references. So I wanted to see
yeah,
kind of your take on that relationship. The two of them were brothers-in-law. Do you want
yeah.
to fill us in a little bit about that relationship?
Yeah, they actually had a quite close relationship most of the time. There was maybe one exception that popped up during the war, but they were pretty close. So they first met in Mexico on a beach on the coastline, and at the time Hill had already been in a battle, and Jackson had not. And he asked Hill, "What was that like to be in a battle? It's the one thing I really want to do." And Hill kind of explained where that came from, and well, they went on. Hill played a role in Jackson moving to Lexington, Virginia, and becoming a professor at VMI, while Hill was on the staff at Washington College. They become fast friends there in Lexington, spent a lot of time together. There's a famous story that's told in the Hill family is that one night Hill and his wife were dealing with a sick child, and if you're a parent, you know what it's like. You just cannot quiet your child. The little girl was sick. They were just at wits end as parents. A knock came on the door, and who was standing there late one night but Jackson? And the family tells the story that Jackson spent that evening. He said, took that child and let the parents get some sleep while Jackson held that baby and walked that baby in a bedroom in the house the rest of the night.
Yeah.
Um, what a great story about the relationship of those two men
Yeah.
that would continue. Hill was primarily responsible for Jackson coming to the Presbyterian Church, who kind of helped usher him in that direction. Hill was also a confidant toward in Jackson's love life, which is kind of fun. Conversation. It goes on, of course, during the war itself. When the Civil War erupted, they both, of course, have occasion to work together, sometimes distantly, sometimes closely, and there was a bit of a falling out for a short period of time around probably 1862, late 1861, where you can kind of detect a hint of jealousy, especially in Hill's wife, because Stonewall is, of course, the most famous man on the planet at that time, getting all the good recognition, promotion, and so forth. And Hill's wife Isabella was jealous. She thought her husband deserved the same because he had fought probably more than anybody in the Confederacy at that point, or at least as much, had done very well, yet was not getting the same recognition. Hill kind of poo-pooed it. maybe secretly had a little bit of resentment as well. But at the end of the day, they came back together again. And during the Fredericksburg campaign, or in its aftermath, they spent a lot of time together, visiting, talking about previous campaigns, talking about their, everything that was going on with their families. But alas, they did not see each other again after Hill left the army in January of 1863, because, of course, Stonewall went on to his end a few months later.
It's interesting you mentioned that tension between the two of them because having read Mariana's letters to Stonewall, she's saying like you need to be nice to him, and it's like you
That's
could
right.
tell like the sisters
Yeah,
have something going on,
they
and
sure do.
and so like you
Yeah,
kind of see her trying to coach like you need to
yeah,
behave here a little bit, and
yeah,
and you do a really nice job of laying out in the book how close these two then become in the wake of the Fredericksburg campaign because they're in the winter quarters together and they're spending a
yeah.
lot of time together. So Hill gets transferred,
Mhm.
and there's a lot of kind of mystery about that. And of course, one of the things that is Lee is best known for is if he doesn't like someone, he transfers him away. And so
Mhm.
the assumption is that that's why
Mhm.
Hill gets
Yeah,
sent away.
that's right.
What's your take on that?
Yeah, my take is that it was Hill's. The Hill was the one behind the transfer. He was not feeling well. He did not have quite the same view of Robert E. Lee as maybe the rest of the entire universe. And thought had some reasons to disagree with Lee. And because of that, because of his health, because of the less speedy promotion and the way he felt he had been treated by the Confederate government up to that point, he decided he had done what he had done. In fact, he'd been talking about leaving the army for over a year, I think, and finally decided it was time, because he was feeling so poorly and was ready to move on. Lee wanted him to stay. Jackson wanted him to stay. They tried to persuade him otherwise, but he put his foot down and said, "Nope, I'm done. I'm leaving." So Lee suggested, well, we don't want to lose your services in the Confederacy, so would you be open to us finding you another role? And they worked with the Confederate government. Hill was posted to the state of North Carolina shortly thereafter, and served there for a little while, which is another story in and of itself. So,
And to me, one of the things that sort of lent credence to the bad feelings between the two and Hill's exile is
mhm.
in the Chancellorsville campaign. Lee's like, "I'm going to need reinforcements. I'm going to get them from Hill," and
Yeah,
Hill's letters to Lee are pretty intransigent about like, "No, you're not getting any of my guys," and it's
that's right.
almost so it
Mhm.
could be read as like,
Yeah,
"Here's a poke in the eye because you sent me down here," but
yeah,
your take is not that.
yeah. Hill was the kind of guy that, yes, he had his issues with Lee, but Hill absolutely believed that North Carolina was about to be struck by federal forces. It was outnumbered at times. He probably underestimated the size of the federal force, excuse me, overestimated the size of the federal force opposing him, overestimated what the Federals were about to do. Um, he thought North Carolina was in grave danger. And so he was doing everything he could to hold on to the slim resources he had. He even suggested horse trading with Lee. You take this unit, I'll take that unit. He offered a bigger unit to Lee. Lee's like, nope, don't want that one. I want the veteran unit, right?
Yeah.
And so it was a little bit childish, a little bit back and forth. At the end of the day, Hill had to surrender because of orders came his way. And at the end of the day, Lee really didn't get the reinforcements he needed because federal forces had descended on Richmond as well and caused the government to kind of hold back, hold those forces. And that, you can lead the line all the way to Pickett's charge that it's a little short on troops for that reason and others. So,
Yeah, wow.
yeah,
And the thing I love about that period of Hill's career, if man, I know you've read it, but if people read the order that he issues when he first gets there, kind of introducing himself,
yeah.
it is about as firebrand a speech or a written order as I
Mhm.
have read from anyone in the Confederacy. I mean, he
Yeah.
is unapologetically hating Yankees in that letter.
He is, and that's something that has not changed back from the algebra textbook that you mentioned. Um, if there's one thing we can say about Hill is that he hated Yankees, just about more than anything. Yankees as well as skulkers, deserters, people who were running away or avoiding their service. That's what he hated more than anything else.
Yeah, and it's a great excuse, to just remind folks, go back and read these primary sources because Hill's a wonderful writer,
He
very
is.
evocative, and so his language is just powerful,
Yeah.
and his emotions come through, his personalities come through. He's a great person to read.
Yeah, his one of my favorite descriptions that he used, during the Maryland campaign as the Army of Northern Virginia headed north towards Maryland. A lot of Confederate soldiers dropped out. They were hungry. They were tired. There was just a lot of stragglers and everything, and a lot of people leaving the ranks. And Hill called them abortions of humanity. I mean, have you ever heard that phrase before? What a great phrase that is.
And those are his own men, right?
Exactly. So that's the kind of guy he was. You knew where you stood with him. So
Well, let me back up a little bit. What is it that got you interested in D.H. Hill in the first place?
well, this is my third Civil War book. I started writing mid '90s. I published a book about North Carolinians who served with Jeb Stuart. I wrote a book about Stoneman's Raid some years after that, of course, which came through North Carolina and Virginia, South Carolina in 1865. I've always been drawn to events that took place in North Carolina and around North Carolina, um, as well as people who came from the state. They always seem to be the events, and the people always seem to be a little underrepresented to me in Civil War literature and in historical literature in general. And so I wanted to help correct that. There's certainly other historians, writers who are doing a good job in that front as well. Michael Hardy and Wade Sokolowski and folks like that are doing great work, and I'm just adding a little bit more to the pile. So
So and being a North Carolinian yourself and
yeah,
having a lot of connections here, I mean, Hill plays a huge part in the history of the state and the history of the state's Civil War story
yeah.
that has been under illuminated, I think.
Yeah, he really does. He's such an important citizen. He spent so much time back and forth with Zebulon Vance, the governor of North Carolina, during his time in North in the Civil War service. Of course, he was a professor at Davidson College before the war, and played a really major role in that institution's future. And was a major Charlotte leader, businessman as a newspaper editor and writer there. Played a really important role in that city's future. And his teaching that he's done at different institutions has played a huge role in molding young students, generations of them who went on to their future careers with D.H. Hill's influence.
Now, you'd mentioned Davidson College, and one of the first things I noticed is this book has a ton of maps, and I've got a map fetish, so I was really excited to see there are all these maps. And one of them is D.H. Hill at Davidson College,
Yeah.
which I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to be a fascinating map, and it was a really neat addition to the book.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit about Hill as an educator, and how does that
Yeah.
kind of shape his worldview, and how is his worldview shaped by that?
Yeah, Hill's education background, of course, was West Point. And at West Point, he learned a system of discipline that we all know about, right? A spit and polish world full of demerits and standing upright and doing things exactly right, or you're going to get a slap on the wrist. And that is the brand of education, a disciplined education that he came to believe in, and he would carry forth at every stop along the way. He was hired at Davidson College for the main reason that his students were considered unruly, out of control. This is a Presbyterian church institution. That's why it was founded by his father-in-law, as among others in the Presbyterian church, and its president. And he came there to institute this brand of disciplined education. And sure enough, put in that system of demerits, kind of laid down the law, became very controversial among the student body for his harshness and how he administered discipline. But at the same time, he was also, by all accounts, a very good teacher. He was pretty well thought of by a number of students. Folks enjoyed his classes and thought he was a pretty gifted teacher as he learned that. And it was something that he honed. When he first became a teacher at Washington College back in Lexington in the early 1850s, he did not think much of his own teaching skills, and he was afraid that he might get found out and fired by that. But he came along. He grew and became quite a good teacher, and went on to be administrator, college president in the post-war years.
It always struck me that the fact that he's a math professor just seemed to jive really well with that sense of rigor and logistics and logic that kind of shapes
Yeah.
that larger approach to life that that was
Yeah.
informed by his military service.
Yeah. Well, being an artilleryman, math is the foundation of the artillery, you might say.
Right.
That all goes together very well. Even though he was just an average mathematician at West Point, a few years later, he was writing a textbook. That's the kind of guy he was. So, uh, I actually had a friend of mine who's an algebra teacher. I'm hopeless at math myself, but a friend of mine who's an algebra teacher to take a look at the textbook for me.
Yeah.
And she looked at it and she said, it's actually pretty good considering it's, based on 1850s ways of teaching and everything. So
And
she,
killing Yankees,
yeah,
as
well,
one
that
parallel.
too. That too.
He was also deeply influenced by his Presbyterian faith. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, most definitely. He was, he grew up in South Carolina, actually, in York County. And his family went to one of the oldest Presbyterian churches there in town, and raised him in the kind of the auspices of that church. He described it as a very hard background. The old school Presbyterian way of looking at religion, looking at God and everything, and that absolutely affected his faith for the rest of his life. His mother was the primary author of that because his father had passed away when he was a young child, 4 or 5 years old. But his mother made sure that he was respectful and religious, and it's something he certainly carried through. And it played a role every single day with him, with Bible studies and prayer sessions with staff members. And I mentioned earlier, um, guiding Jackson to the Presbyterian Church. He always thought the Presbyterian Church was the most perfect institution ever created,
Yeah.
and lived with that his whole life. Although, as the Civil War continued, he started to develop a little bit of a different view of Christianity. He realized as the war continued, as he saw so much carnage, that one of the things that was missing, maybe from his early Christian or early church leanings, is the kind of love the church teaches, that Christianity teaches. And he felt like he was kind of missing that.
Mm.
And it was something he wanted to push towards his children, and work to do that the rest of his life.
Now, Isabella, his wife, is also a huge influence in his life.
Yeah.
Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, Isabella, of course, as you mentioned, one of the Morrison sisters, right? Reverend Morrison, out of Lincoln County, South Carolina, had several beautiful daughters by all accounts. One of them ended up being Stonewall Jackson's wife, one of them being Rufus Barringer's wife, a North Carolina cavalryman during the war, and one of Hill's friends at most of the time there in Charlotte. It's another story. And other sisters of Isabella married other Confederate officers, including one of Hill's staff officers. Um, but it's a very tight knit family, very Presbyterian family, because his father-in-law was one of the most famous Presbyterian ministers of all time.
Yeah.
I would think Reverend Morrison. But those Morrison sisters, Isabella played a huge role in his life because she certainly had opinions that she shared with her husband. And there aren't many letters from her that are still in existence that I've been able to find, but you can tell by Hill's reply that sometimes he's kind of put out with her, uh,
Huh?
and trying to get her to do things, and she's just not listening. Or not paying attention to what her husband wants her to do. And so there's a little bit of back and forth behind the scenes. They still very much love each other. There's no question about it. But it's fun to see that marriage and how important it is for them.
So when the war breaks out, where does Hill stand on that, and kind of what are his attitudes as
Yeah.
things start to unfold?
Well, as I put in my book, one of my the favorite things I ever wrote was that Hill tried to secede because North Carolina decided not to early on. Uh, as North Carolina was kind of trying to hem and haw, in those early days of secession after South Carolina had already left, Hill decided, I've had enough. I'm ready to serve this new nation. So he wrote Jefferson Davis, who was forming the new government, forming the new army. Hill had his two brothers. One of them is named AP, by the way, not to be confusing with Ambrose Powell Hill, but one of them was named AP, but had his two brothers who also lived in Mississippi, like Davis at the time, and asked them to kind of intervene on his behalf to try to get Davis to assign Hill a job. Didn't work out. Eventually, the state of North Carolina decided to secede, as we all know, and Hill got invited to serve the state of North Carolina as within its armed forces and early training. But Hill was very much a supporter of secession. In fact, about the time of Fort Sumter, he decides when everything's going on in Charleston Harbor, just before the cannonade takes place, he decides he's going to go down there and see what's going on himself. So he hopped a train and went down to Charleston. Didn't arrive in time to see the bombardment, but he certainly arrived in time to yuck it up with some of his West Pointer friends there at some Fort Moultrie, where he had been stationed as a pre-war soldier. Very much a supporter of secession. He was, and for him, it was less of an issue about slavery, although that was certainly an issue. His challenge was always about the term Black Republicans. That's exactly what he was battling against, and he thought South Carolina and North Carolina were in grave danger, and that's why he went to war.
So how do his attitudes stay the same or change over the course of the war toward the Confederacy, toward Black Republicans?
He remained an avid Yankee hater for the rest of the war, so that never changed. Continued to believe in the rightness of the Confederate cause, but he soured on the way the Confederacy was handling everything it did. He was also souring on the way people back home were handling things because he thought there were a lot of people who were shirking duties. He thought there were a lot of able-bodied men who were back home partying, having a good time. They should have been in the army, but they were not. All of that really made him additionally sour, and it certainly affected himself and the way he served. Still didn't prevent him from serving, with one exception that I'm sure we'll talk about. But he was ready and willing to serve on his terms throughout the war, nonetheless, because he wanted to fight and do everything he could to make the Confederacy successful.
And I know that was problematic for him, particularly after he gets assigned to North Carolina, which I won't say it's unscathed through the war, but it doesn't experience the war the way that Virginia does, the way that Tennessee does, the way. And so, it's not until really late as the vice is closing in. So, like, he has a really, I think, interesting period through 63 and into 64 where it's just a much different war for him than it is for a lot of the people he considers his peers.
Yeah. Oh, very true. He had a falling out with Jefferson Davis essentially after Chickamauga. He battled in Chickamauga. We all know he served there as a corps commander under Braxton Bragg in the Army of Tennessee. That didn't go well for a lot of reasons, and Hill found himself without a job soon thereafter. Braxton Bragg relieved him of command. Um, Hill wanted to know why. Give me a reason why. If there are charges, prefer them. If I did something wrong, put me on trial. Nobody did. Um, so he finally turned around and told Davis, well, President Davis, if I've done nothing wrong and you will not give me a trial to exonerate me for the reason I'm out of a job, because it really looks bad, then give me a letter that says you did everything you should have. You did a great job, something like that. Davis refused. And so, for that very reason, because Davis refused to give him a pat on the back publicly, and Hill refused to serve unless he got that letter, he basically sat unused, with the exception of serving as a volunteer aide here and there, a couple places in the war. Basically, sat at home unused, which was really a loss to the Confederacy.
Sure.
Talented guy like that, why wouldn't you take advantage of all the people you had? All he was asking for was something that was pretty much the same thing that Davis gave to Polk after Polk was relieved from the Army of Tennessee, but for some reason he didn't choose to do that.
And it seems like Hill is sort of set up for failure when it gets sent out to Chickamauga. I mean, because nobody can get along with Braxton Bragg. And by that point, Hill's kind of got a track record as someone who's hard to get along with. Like, nobody saw that might be a problem.
Yeah. The funny thing about it is, though, is that Hill and Bragg had a long history together. They'd known each other for years. At one point, Hill wrote that Braxton Bragg's the best friend I've got.
Yeah.
This was before the war. And he arrived thinking they'd be able to work together, thinking that, that they'd restore their old friendship, work together, things would go just hunky dory. And of course, anything but happened. And, you know, for various reasons, the performance that Hill put forth on the battlefield at Chickamauga was uneven, didn't go as well as it should have because of a lot of miscommunication, a lot of crossed orders, and a lot of questioning. Why are you ordering me to do that? I don't agree with your command. Things like that that would never happen in the Army of Northern Virginia. They happen
Right.
all the time in the Army of Tennessee.
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. I mean, like, it's not like Polk wasn't doing the same thing. And, I mean, you could
yeah,
have said that about a number of Bragg's subordinates
for
during that
sure.
battle. Yeah.
And yet Hill was kind of scapegoated, is the way he thought about it,
Yeah.
for what happened in the kind of officer cabal after Chickamauga. Many people blamed him for writing the petition that was sent to Richmond, supposedly asking for the removal of Braxton Bragg, and the evidence is that he did not write it, but he did sign it. So he was kind of blamed for that.
And you talk about him, getting sent off to limbo, basically exiled, and you use the phrase as it was a real loss to the Confederacy. And I kind of want to tie that back to this idea, like, I hold the opinion that he's one of the most talented division commanders that the
Yeah,
Confederacy has, and he demonstrates that, throughout 61, 62 into
yeah.
63. And like, um, why do they let such talent go unused?
It's a really good question. Joseph E. Johnston actually said that Hill was the best, or at least one of the best division or corps commanders that the Army had at its disposal. And it was a real loss. He was by no means perfect on the battlefield. He was flawed in several of the engagements he fought, but he still did a lot of good things on the battlefield. If I had to have a defensive position set and a general to command it, I'd probably choose him over about anybody I could think of. And attack wasn't so bad either. It was just a real silly kind of a decision by the Confederate government not to put him to work. Um, it was silly for him to probably draw the line and say, I'm not going to serve unless you give me this letter, right? He did not lower himself or humble himself to do that, and he really should have. And so it's just not a good story. Nobody seemed to take the high road during that time period.
Yeah. What would you say is his high point of the war?
Yeah, wow, that's a tough one. Seven Pines is probably really pretty high up there.
Okay.
Um, it is in his quarter of the battlefield, which of course is a much broader battlefield than where he fights, but in his area of the battlefield, he leads an incredibly successful attack down the Williamsburg Road that ejects really one major Yankee line, two Yankee lines, and threatens more. With the help of some really good Confederate soldiers on the ground. And with more support, who knows what could have happened with more support on other parts of the battlefield that day. The next day, as Seven Pines, June 1st, was a little bit more uneven, but he remained essentially in command. It's almost a corps command because Longstreet basically said, "Here, you can have my troops," and he put them to work. But the moment had passed by that point. I don't think they had an opportunity to really do more. But Seven Pines is pretty, I would say, pretty much the high point of his contribution. That being said, he did some pretty remarkable things at Antietam and South Mountain, and had great moments elsewhere in the war as well. But that stands out to me.
Yeah, I'm a big fan of his South Mountain action,
Yeah,
where he really, basically holds the pass all day long and buys
yeah.
Lee the time he needs to consolidate. So,
He shows his fighting spirit there, no doubt about that.
yeah, for sure. So, we talked a little bit about Chickamauga. So let's pretend that at least qualifies as a contender for a low point. Is there
Yeah.
a different or other low point that you might look at?
Yeah, the last day at Chickamauga really is the low point. But what's comical about it is that he's blamed to this day for what happened on the morning of September 21st. Polk and everybody in Polk's command blamed Hill for not beginning the attack early enough that morning, um, because orders were garbled and delayed and so forth. That wasn't the worst part of the day for Hill.
Right.
He botched the afternoon attack when they could have successfully ejected federal defenders from that kind of left flank position that Federals are in. Eventually, they did it anyway, but they could have done it much earlier. And who knows how that would have affected the last stand that Thomas affected. That afternoon as well. But I really do think that was the low point of his entire career for
Yeah.
sure.
Okay, okay.
Yeah.
I know there's some times during the 7 days where it kind of, gets some wires crossed a little bit, but
For sure.
so does everybody. So like I don't think you can really point to some of those as like, oh, this is a terrible, action by
Yeah.
Hill when everyone else is also kind of falling apart.
That's right. He fought really hard during the 7 days, imperfectly. Again, Malvern Hill, of course, is kind of infamous for the charge that took place, and that was a famous moment with Lee, where he basically Hill went up to Lee and recommended that Malvern Hill was not the best place to attack, and this came on the suggestion of a gentleman who lived in the neighborhood and knew the terrain, and Lee kind of ignored the suggestion. Longstreet laughed at him. And they went on, of course, and got just severely mauled. Hill's uh, division as well as others on the field that day,
Right.
and that helped certainly made him bitter about the way the army was being commanded.
Yeah. Now you mentioned Longstreet a second ago, and of course with Chickamauga, Longstreet's there as well.
Yeah.
How would you describe their relationship? Because I know particularly post-war that
Yeah.
that transforms a little bit.
It does. They're close, but early on during the war, they're classmates at West Point. They remained friends throughout, off and on a little bit, but really more so during the Civil War. They're very close. Back to Seven Pines, Longstreet puts a huge amount of trust in Hill. He writes that I knew you were on the field and in charge. I was not worried at all because Longstreet had other duties that first afternoon, and they remained close throughout the war. Um, but to your point, after the war, as Longstreet began to, um, you know, move his political leanings more in the direction of the Republicans and more in the directions of Reconstruction, there were a number of Southerners who did not think much about Longstreet. Hill was one of those, although they certainly. I think you can say fairly that they reconciled to some degree. They did exchange letters late in life, and Longstreet said, well, you can, you have kind of given me a hard time, but they both realized at this point that they were non-Virginians in the Lost Cause era. They might as well hang together because everybody was blaming Longstreet for losing Gettysburg and Hill for losing Chickamauga. So,
Yeah. Yeah, being the outside guys in the Lost Cause
yeah.
formation, it's like a gave them common cause themselves. Yeah,
Yeah, indeed. That I think that kind of brought them back together again. So,
yeah. So Hill's got a very, I think, very influential role in the Lost Cause and kind of how we think about the war.
yeah.
How would you characterize the impact that he made on Civil War memory in that regard?
Yeah, he did have a major impact on Civil War memory. So, he was the publisher of one of the very first post-war publications, The Land We Love, that really talked about Confederate memory, Confederate history, and he did a lot of really good work to publish the memories of veterans, to publish official reports, to try to tell the truth of the war as he saw it. One of the best columns in that whole publication is called the Haversack. It's a where veterans, Confederate veterans, could write in, send in their memories, little anecdotes, little stories. A lot of them are hilarious, telling things that happened to them during the war. It's a great resource. I'm sure you've used it. Fantastic. So, and that was really just the beginning. Was all he put in that publication. He came back later in life and contributed to the Battles and Leaders series that Century Magazine ran. Kind of had a hiatus in there. Hill's Hill's brand of the Lost Cause, though, was a little different. In the pages of the Southern Historical Society, you would see more things that were more positive about Robert E. Lee, that were more positive about the leaders of the Confederacy. Hill's brand was different. He was not so enamored with the leadership of the Confederacy as he was with the Confederate soldier.
Mhm.
His lost cause was this Confederate soldier can do no wrong. He could defeat any force in front of him as long as he was properly led, and that's what didn't happen very often. So,
Yeah, yeah. So, what do you think Hill's kind of final impact is for us today as we look back on the Civil War?
mm. I think it's really interesting to look at Hill as the consummate man of his times. He was such a Southerner that he bled, the South. He was such a man of his state. North Carolina and South Carolina, being where he was born, were more important to him than anything else, and he fought for it that way. He defined his life based on the institutions he participated in and the armies he served. To kind of defend those places and those states, and the way he did it with passion, um, I think that's something we can all learn from as a man who has the passion. We can certainly argue about the correctness of what he was passionate about, but what went into his life is just amazing, is how hard he fought. And I don't care if it was a classroom, if it was a magazine page or a battlefield. He fought harder than anybody else around him, and that's what's pretty remarkable about D.H. Hill.
And you mentioned there a second ago about, we can argue about what he directed his passion toward, but we can learn from that passion. And this is, a kind of an untrendy time to write about a Confederate general, and
For
yet
sure.
we can still learn something from writing and reading about these guys. Tell me a little bit about that, because I think that's
Yeah.
an important point.
Yeah, no question about it. He absolutely, writing anything about a Confederate figure is controversial, but it's so important that we understand their perspective and understand where they came from. We got to learn from the past so we don't, but we don't do things like that are silly ourselves, for sure. But the way people live, and the things that they do with their lives are absolutely things that we can remember and model ourselves on. He was a smart guy, very well read. His library still exists to some degree to this day, and it's pretty amazing to see all the different things he read. Right, he read multiple languages, mainly from his love for the Bible, from scriptures. Carried a Greek New Testament with him in his pocket as he marched in the Mexico campaign. That's the kind of guy he was, and he left no stone unturned as far as he could throughout his lifetime, and I think that's pretty admirable.
Yeah. You mentioned him being a man of his time, and I haven't asked what were his attitudes about slavery?
Yeah, he did own slaves, just a modest amount. I think he had 4 or 5 slaves. It was the sort of slavery that you might define as more common in the Carolinas. There was less about a plantation. It was more about slaves who would assist around the household, because he never had more than just a little farm himself. And his attitudes were simply he was raised with slaves. His father was and grandfather essentially was a major slaveholder in York County, South Carolina, at an ironworks there. Um, and so he was raised in the kind of in that slavery world. It was everywhere. It was normal for him, um, and he would take advantage of it as it made sense,
Mm.
and question others. He had a viewpoint that was similar to what some branches of the Presbyterian Church had about slavery: is that our job as Christians, as Presbyterians, is to try to help the slaves be more Christian in their world. Um, that was the viewpoint.
Yeah.
You can again debate about the correctness of
Sure,
that one
sure,
as
sure,
well,
sure. Yeah.
but that's the way he looked at things. So
Very good. Well, as we head into the home stretch here, any final thoughts you'd like to share about your book?
yeah, it was just an amazing journey, I think, to follow Hill every step of the way, from those pre-war days. The other thing that's pretty remarkable about him, I think, is that both of his grandfathers were Revolutionary War heroes.
Yeah.
And he modeled himself after that. He had uncles as well as his father who served in later wars for the United States. So it was only natural that he would be a soldier. As a South Carolinian, one of his heroes was John Calhoun,
Okay.
who, he probably learned a few things from watching how Calhoun handled himself too, if you're familiar with that politician, for sure. But that really set the foundation for him, as his grandfathers being Revolutionary War heroes. When Yankee troops came marching south, it almost felt like the British were back.
Yeah.
There were British forces that burned his grandfather's ironworks during the war. Um, and it sort of felt
Wow.
like maybe the British are back, and this is part of the reason I'm defending my homeland. Um, Always felt a little bit like that to Hill for me.
Yeah, wow. Well, and that's kind of a neat tie-in, of course, to the American 250 going on
Yeah,
too.
absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, the book is Confederate General D.H. Hill, A Military Life by Chris Hartley, available from Savas Beatty. I urge you to pick it up. I can't wait to dig into it myself. And Chris, what a pleasure chatting with you about this.
My pleasure, Chris. I really, really enjoyed it. Good to see you on here. You do a great job. I enjoy your podcast. So
Well, it's my privilege, and I wish you all the best with the book.
thank you very much.
So,
All right. Take care.
I'm Chris Mackowski for the Emerging Civil War podcast. We'll see you online and on the battlefield.